Canadian Mohamed Ali left the country more than 4 years ago to join the so-called Islamic State. Now it appears he's been detained in Syria and could be coming back to Canada. According to a report from Global News, Kurdish authorities are holding him along with his Canadian wife and 2 children, and they want to turn the family over to Ottawa. But the RCMP might face challenges actually charging the man. Jessica Davis is the president and principal consultant at Insight Threat Intelligence. Davis spent 17 years in the Canadian security and intelligence business. She joins me now in studio. So Jessica Davis, let's start with the question of who this man is. Mohamed Ali, also known as Abu Turab el-Kanadi. Give us a sense of him.
So in a snapshot, this is an individual who left to join the Islamic State in about 2014, I think it's April 2014. And over the course of the last 4.5 years, he's basically, if we're to believe the reports, has worked as a sniper for the Islamic State, which makes him an order of magnitude greater threat than anybody that we've seen from a Canadian perspective before. You know, this summer we were talking a lot about Abu Huzaifa, who worked as an enforcer for the Islamic State and potentially committed some executions. But Mohamed Ali is an individual who worked as a sniper. That's a position of trust, implies training, significant access to weapons, and if he did it for 4 years, it implies that he was pretty good at it.
Okay, and so when it comes to the question of potentially this man returning to Canada, what does this mean for Canadian authorities?
They really have 2 very bad options in front of them. The first one is to leave him in Kurdish custody, which, you know, is not a long-term solution. Everybody who fought with the Islamic State needs to come back to Canada and face repercussions here. We have an international obligation to do that. We can't be exporting our problems to other countries, to other regions to deal with. And the Kurdish authorities also don't have the capacity to incarcerate these individuals long-term. So the second option is obviously to bring him home. And that's a terrible option, particularly if the RCMP is not positioned to lay charges. And unfortunately, since they haven't laid any charges on him yet in absentia, I have significant concerns about whether or not they can do that. This man cannot come back to Canada free. He would pose a significant threat.
Why would it be difficult? Obviously, we don't know what's in the minds of the RCMP, but this is somebody who has tweeted, for instance, pictures of his gun. Why would it be difficult to charge somebody in this position? I think most people in the public would say this seems like a slam dunk.
Well, we have a lot of information, so I'm hopeful that some of that information can be corroborated and turned into evidence. The problem with tweets and social media is it's very difficult to prove who's actually on the other end of those tweets, those posts. So getting into an evidentiary threshold on those might be challenging. It does seem like there's an abundance of information here, so hopefully some of that can actually move into the evidentiary realm.
Okay, we do want to get to his family in just a moment, but I want to mention what Global Affairs Canada has been saying about this thus far, because they are talking about this, it seems, as a consular issue, saying in part that Canada's ability to provide consular assistance in all parts of Syria is extremely limited. What does that mean when you hear that? What's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is really less about what Global Affairs is doing and more about what the Government of Canada is not saying about this. So while I understand that they cannot contribute or comment on the specifics of a particular case, what I'd really like to see from the government is a broader strategy and an articulation of that strategy to Canadians in terms of how they're dealing with these individuals. Because I don't think that it's sufficient to leave Canadians in the dark, particularly when you have individuals who could pose this much of a threat or have done some really significantly bad things with the Islamic State.
Now, of course, at this point, this is all sort of in the realm of the hypothetical, but does it say something about our own system that it would be so complicated or perhaps difficult? Like, is there something that we're lacking if it is difficult to charge people who seem to, if we believe their social media claims, be bragging about some of these things?
It's a bit of a mixed bag because I think in a lot of ways it reflects well on the Canadian judicial system that it is difficult to, lay charges because we do require a high standard of proof. On the other hand, it is frustrating from an intelligence or security perspective that individuals like this can potentially be free.
Okay, let's talk about the other aspect of this. His wife is Canadian. The family has 2 children that we understand are also being detained. How do you think Canadian authorities should respond to that situation?
Well, I think the first thing that absolutely needs to happen is we need to disaggregate women and children. So When we talk about the women of the Islamic State, they're often referred to as jihadi brides. The problem with that is that women played a much broader role in the Islamic State than just wives. They've played roles as intelligence operatives, they've been suicide bombers, they've been medical personnel, they've been enforcers of the morality laws. So in terms of dealing with Rita Jabbar, his wife, we need to understand what role she actually played in the Islamic State and not just make an assumption that she was just there as his wife, because from what I've understood to be the case, she actually traveled to the Islamic State of her own volition to join that terrorist organization, which definitely implies a certain level of agency and responsibility for her actions while she was there.
It might be a difficult question to answer, but I just wonder, given particularly the report out of Global News suggests that this is not an isolated case, that there are in fact other Canadian families that are in the same position right now that are sort of in this, in limbo, I'll say for lack of a better term. How long can Canada allow this to go on for? I mean, at what point are they sort of forced to make some kind of decision about the situation of these people?
Well, I'm really not sure on that, because I'm not sure what forces would force their hand, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. I think they're up against a clock. I don't know what that clock looks like.
Okay, and so what do you think is the single best thing the Canadian government could do at this point?
You know, from my perspective, I think it's really about hoping that the RCMP is in a position to lay charges, because without that, those two options that I laid out earlier are really bad ones. You know, having Mohamed Ali come back to Canada and not immediately be in custody would represent a significant threat to the security of Canada, and one that would probably really tax the RCMP and CSIS's ability to monitor and mitigate those threats.
Well, I guess that's what I would ask, is if indeed anyone who was indeed an ISIS fighter were to return to Canada, we would imagine that if they weren't charged, this would be a situation of round-the-clock surveillance.
I would assume so, and particularly with somebody of his caliber, you know, somebody who has the training and, you know, frankly, unfortunately, the street cred, because he's been posting publicly about his exploits. You know, there's the threat that he poses himself physically in terms of his capabilities, but there's also his ability to inspire other individuals to undertake terrorist acts or adopt the ideology. I think both ways, it's really bad.
Okay, well, it is definitely a very troubling scenario, but we thank you for taking the time to walk us through it. Thank you, Jessica Davis.